think most people, reasonable people would think that reporting somebody to social services because you don't like their views and therefore targeting their children is not a reasonable thing to do.
So Stella, I mean, this is an incredibly horrendous story. Just explain to my readers what happened. Sorry, explain to my listeners what happened.
It's very, very simple. In November last year, I got a phone call from the head of social services in my local area saying that a safeguarding panel had met a MASH panel to consider whether there were any concerns about my children following an allegation, and that the consequence of that panel was actually they decided they were quite worried about me and the person who'd made the complaint. And so they were ringing to say, what's the process for reporting safeguarding concerns about yourself? And I was completely floored. I was like, what on earth are you talking about? And have we actually had an investigation into the welfare of my children? What's going on? And it transpired that somebody who had been emailing my office for some months, a sort of stream of consciousness of thoughts of his anger at the campaigning we've been doing on violence against women and his views that people like me must hate men if we wanted to tackle it, had made a report to social services. Now, at that point, and I've never seen this report, I have to be clear, so I don't know the contents of it. But obviously, we reported it to the police. The police then actually tracked this man down. He turned out to be in Leicestershire. So it was transferred over to Leicestershire Police to investigate. And obviously, because he'd already been targeting me and escalated his contact, he'd also been writing to other women in the public eye, other female campaigners, because he copied them into the emails he'd been sending to me, and also other MPs. We were looking at it as a very clear-cut, very simple case of harassment. But Leicestershire Police have been very clear that he is entitled, because my views are extreme, and they've used this language, to raise his concerns and to have them investigated. And in fact, at one point quoted the ECHR to me as the reason why his views and his right to do that must be protected, because I am in the public eye. But the consequence of this is my kids have got a social services record, and we're also greenlighting the idea that if you disagree with someone, because all along what they've said is, oh yeah, he's got no evidence that you're a risk to your children apart from his views on your views. So if you disagree with somebody, we're saying it's perfectly reasonable to report them to social services and have an investigation.
I mean, there's a lot to get our heads around here, but just to recap, a man in Leicester didn't like your views, your well-known feminist views. He thought they were extreme. These are views like ending violence against women and girls. This is things like fighting for better rights for mothers in Parliament. He didn't like your views. He reported you to social services, saying that he thought your views were going to damage your own children. This triggered a safeguarding review. It was reported to social services, baseless inquiry. And then at the end of it, must have been very traumatic for you and your kids and your partner and your whole family and everything. And then Leicester Police tells you that he was entitled to make this kind of vexatious claim because they said that you should expect to be challenged because of the public nature of your role. I mean, I think many people will just find that extraordinary. So what the police basically said to you is because you're in the public eye, you're fair game.
Absolutely. And frankly, worse than that. And they reasoned out that this man didn't hate women in making this complaint, but I did have views that could be considered extreme. So they had taken his explanation. And the irony of this is I've just recently pushed through legislation in Parliament in partnership with Greg Clark about protecting people from public harassment that says that if somebody says, look, I'm not harassing you, that can't be a defence against prosecution if a reasonable person would think that their behaviour was harassment. I think most people, reasonable people would think that reporting somebody to social services because you don't like their views and therefore targeting their children is not a reasonable thing to do.
And also, I think many of my listeners, you know, and we have listeners on Times Radio from across the political spectrum. There may be many listeners here who don't agree with your politics, for example. But the idea that the police think that you should expect to have this behaviour because of the public nature of your role, would they have said that about Joe Cox? You know, I feel like there's a lot of victim blaming here. I mean, is that how you feel?
Well, actually, what was really frustrating is they said, look, this man's got mental health issues. They never told me how they'd actually assess that. I was pushing for him to be cautioned because he'd used an alias. In fact, we think he used several aliases. He was targeting several different women. I suspect I might not be the only person he has targeted for this kind of behaviour. I know other women have experiences where they've been reported to social services. So a caution would have allowed it to be recorded on the police database. It would have allowed the intelligence about his behaviour. It would have allowed us possibly to tackle other crimes. They haven't even done that. They've gone around, they said, oh, we've told him not to do it again, but if he does it again, we'll come back to you. Well, how would I know, given that he uses aliases?
So just to be clear, he used an alias. So there's no record of him doing this. So he could do it again to you. He could target another female MP and there'd be no record of it.
No, there'd be no record of it. But there is a record with my children with social services. And I'll give you a real world example of what that practically means, Aisha. A couple of weeks ago, I had to take my son to A&E. He was very, very unwell. And of course, they ask you in A&E if your child is known to social services. What on earth am I supposed to say to that? Because at that point in time, when you just want your child to be treated, because my son turned out to be very, very unwell and needed antibiotics, the last thing you want to do is get into a long, drawn-out conversation about, yes, but it was a malicious complaint and it's a lockdown. It's a nightmare. And I am somebody who passionately believes in safeguarding, who knows that we've had real problems where indeed people in the public eye have not been investigated. So we absolutely must investigate them. But in order for people to have confidence in that process, and frankly, in order not to waste time which could be spent on serious complaints, we need to be clear that if you use social services to harass people in the same way we use any other form of third-party reporting, there should be consequences. And what the police reaction was, well, actually, it's reasonable for him to think that you might be a risk to your kids. So it's reasonable for him to report you as part of a pattern of behaviour. So the most we're going to do is say to him, look, that probably caused a bit of distress. Don't do it again. When actually what you should be doing is looking at the pattern of his behaviour and saying there's a clear course of conduct. This is a form of harassment. If you continue, because you now have a criminal record, there'll be much more serious sanctions. I worry that this gives the green light to another form of how you try and push parents, but it will be mainly mums, public life.
Well, it's women, isn't it? And I think what's very chilling about this is it's deeply misogynistic. And clearly this man hates you for your views on feminism. And he wanted to hurt you and punish you and cause you pain in the most traumatic way. And for most mothers, the thought of having their children taken away from them or some investigation alleging that they were mistreating their children, I mean, that's a pretty horrendous thing to go through. This is somebody who's deliberately thinking, right, how can I really hurt this person? I mean, what was that like for you, emotionally to go through that and for your family?
Well, look, I think most people, the thought that somebody thinks that they don't care for their children enough, that their children shouldn't be with them, is a terrifying thought. I mean, my kids are my world, and I've been fighting to make it possible for more people who particularly have young children to be part of our political process, because it is so hard anyway. The dinosaurs in Parliament, their outdated attitudes about the hours of Parliament, the way Parliament should work, whether or not when you have children, you're committed to your job. Many women will relate to that. But the idea that then also by simply being somebody who campaigns for something makes me a bad parent is a terrifying process, because of course, my children are complete bystanders in this. I mean, thankfully, they're too young at the moment to really understand what's gone on. But other MPs and other people in the public eye who have faced this have older kids, and they will be aware of this, and people questioning them rather than saying this is completely unacceptable. What the police did by saying, well, this was reasonable, but also saying, oh, this man doesn't hate women. I mean, if it isn't a form of hatred of women to target them because you disagree with their views and to expect that you have the right to, I don't know what is.
Yeah, and to put that fear in their head that possibly they're going to have their children taken away from them. I mean, that is pretty hateful and vicious and vindictive and counts as harassment. I'm sure most of my listeners listening to this will think that sounds like harassment to me. So Stella, what next? I mean, are you worried that he's going to come back again? I know he said that he's sorry and he won't do this again, but you don't know that. Are you worried he's going to have another go?
I don't. I've not had any contact with him. I was very clear I didn't want to have any contact with him, in the same way I was very clear with the police that I didn't accept them using what they call a community resolution, which is supposed to be used for things like fly tipping and neighbour disputes rather than harassment cases. As a resolution to this, to which point they said, well, it doesn't matter what you think, which again doesn't bode well for how we treat people who are victims of harassment. I worry this is happening to other women, particularly in the public. I know it has, for example, to Ashley James. I've talked to other women who've been targeted in this way. If they've made an allegation to the police that was malicious, they could be done for wasting police time. That's actually a fine or a 6 months jail sentence in some cases. it seems to me that either we need to give better guidance to the police, frankly, about what misogyny is and what harassment is, and that's indeed the legislation that many of us have been working on, or we need to bring in a concept of wasting public authorities' time when it comes to malice. Because I think it's very clear, everybody says this is vexatious. The man had never met me, he's never been around my kids. There's no suggestion he has any evidence other than his perception of my views. That is a clear-cut case of wasting the time of my local social services, which could be better spent safeguarding children in my area. We've got to put a line in the sand, A, about people in public life, but B, also more generally about precious public resources. Now, we do that with the police. I think we should be looking at doing that with others as well.
And have you had any contact with the Home Office about this? Will you bring this up with the Home Secretary? We know we have a Home Secretary who's very keen on recognising what a woman is and you know, being very pro-woman. They're very against the chilling of free speech. As you say, this case probably gives the green light to other trolls who haven't sort of thought of this. Would you expect the Home Secretary to do something about this?
Well, I'm a passionate defender of free speech myself, but you can't have free speech when 50% of the conversation is in fear of what you might do if they disagree with you. You know, you can have a strong, robust argument without resorting to trying to take somebody's children away. I haven't had contact with the Home Office. I've had contact with the Department of Education, mainly because we've been looking at whether or not this record could be deleted so that my kids don't have to answer awkward questions, or I don't have to answer questions about getting them into school, say, and having this record there. And the ministers have been very sympathetic to the need to act. I'd like to hear now what the Home Secretary and the Home Office has to say about this and about the different ways in which harassment is taking place. I also want to pay tribute to Liz Kendall and John Ashworth, who are the local MPs in Leicestershire and have already raised this with their Chief Constable and are very, very concerned about the implications of this case. So let's see what those two things do. But absolutely, one of the reasons I've come forward, you know, I get so much grief from people that all I ever seem to do is talk about mums and babies, but there are lots of brilliant mums out there who make fantastic members of parliament, journalists, public advocates, and they're put off speaking out because of things like this. So we've got to change it.
And on that point, I mean, many maybe female listeners who thought, oh, you know, might be interested in a role in public life, as you say, as a politician, as a counsellor, as a journalist like I am. You know, doesn't this really put women off? I mean, is this not another example? I mean, we all remember horrendous situation with Jo Cox. We know that female MPs across the political spectrum are subject to a huge amount of abuse. And now this, I mean, doesn't this all just put a lot of good women off, Stella?
Well, and particularly women of colour, particularly targeted. It's completely unacceptable. For too long, everyone's talked about it, but nobody's done anything about it. But look, that's also why I set up the Mother Red campaign to fund mums to stand for selection, because frankly, I don't think change is going to come from Westminster. Westminster is too much set in its ways, too antiquated. I've been told in trying to push to make Parliament family friendly, I'm pushing things too far to expect it to be possible to combine being a good mum with being a good MP.
I mean, Stella,
but what we've been doing is funding.
I've heard that said of you from people who, you know, are meant to be quite liberal, progressive people.
But we're missing out on talent as a result. And frankly, I think people recognise that politics needs new ideas, new voices. That's why I'm really proud of the Mother Red women. We've funded 55 of them to stand so far. 12 of them have been selected. And frankly, they're nothing like the existing Parliament. The diversity of the candidates, whether they are single parents, they have children with special educational needs. But we are all of one mind that the answer isn't for women to bend to these situations and soak up this kind of abuse. The answer is to change the law and tackle these issues so that more voices can be heard. And actually what I'd say is it damages everybody when you only hear a small proportion, whether it's in public life or daily life. So tackling those people who want to shout other people down and abuse them, changing our practices so that it is possible to combine family life with public life will benefit everybody, not just the mums we're missing out on. And that's the positive story I want to give you. Like, absolutely, this is grim, but I wouldn't be speaking up if I didn't think things could be different. I'm just calling people out and saying, we're not going to accept this anymore, so change it with us.